The first cold morning of November 1814 arrived in Aldermere as it always did, with frost on the casement glass and the smell of coal smoke settling low over the village rooftops. Margaret Vane did not see the frost until she had already been awake for 2 hours, her needle moving through the dim light of a single tallow candle. The estate ledger opened beside her on the work table she shared. With the bolts of cloth, and the pinned patterns, and the wax-smooth thread that constituted both her livelihood. Father. She was 22 years old, and had been the village seamstress of Aldermere for 14 months since her father's death had left her the cottage, and the trade, and nothing else. She was slight, with dark auburn hair she wore, pinned tightly beneath a plain cap, and she had her father's habit of precision. Every stitch counted, every seam measured twice, every column of figures verified before she allowed herself to believe what the columns said. The ledger she was studying was not her own. It belonged to the Aldermere estate, or rather it had once belonged to the estate, before the late Earl of Ketteredge had died in the autumn of 1812, before the title had passed to his son, before the new Earl had taken himself to London and left the running of the property entirely to his bailiff, Mr. Purdy. Oliver Tench. Margaret had come to possess the ledger by accident, or by the kind of accident that is made possible only when the person responsible has ceased to believe that a seamstress might read. Mr. Brush. Tench had brought a coat to her 2 weeks prior. A heavy winter overcoat split at the seam. When she had found the ledger tucked into the lining as though used as padding or wadding, she had said nothing. She had set it aside. She had looked at it that evening with no expectation of finding anything worth the looking. Then she had found the numbers. If there is a moment when a life pivots, hers pivoted there. At the work table, by the candle, in the silence after midnight. She had expected ordinary figures, ordinary sums. What she found instead was 2 columns that did not reconcile. The column labeled rentals collected differed from the column labeled rentals remitted to a state account by amounts that were small enough, taken singly, to look like clerical rounding. Taken across 14 months, they added to something very different. She was still looking at the ledger that November morning when the frost appeared on the glass. The village of Aldermere was small enough that a stranger was noticed before his carriage had fully stopped. When the 2 horses in the traveling coach bearing a crest Margaret did not immediately recognize came down the high street just before the noon hour, she heard it from inside the cottage and looked up from her work. The crest, when she leaned to the window to read it, was the Ketteredge Arms. She had hemmed enough household linen with that border to know it without thinking. He had come. She had heard the rumors, as anyone who sewed for the village's housekeepers and wives must hear rumors, which is to say she had heard everything. The new Earl of Ketteredge was cold. He was proud. He had been seen twice in the county since inheriting, and had spoken to no one on either occasion. He had left the running of Aldermere to Mr. Runn. Tench so entirely and so completely that some of the older tenants had begun to wonder whether they had a lord at all. The village had decided what it thought of Caroline Vane's daughter. She was useful, which was a different thing from Mattering. She mended and altered and fitted and turned hems, and when the year's ledger was settled, she was paid in coin that was sometimes slow in coming, and always carefully counted. To the estate's household she was a necessary account, to the bailiff she suspected. She was invisible. She did not know she had already become visible to someone else. His name was Edmund Carrel, the Earl of Ketteredge, and he was 34 years old. And he had not wanted to come to Aldermere. He had come because his solicitor in London, a dry and cautious man named Hargreaves, had laid 3 documents on his desk in October, and said, very quietly, that the rental accounts from the estate did not correspond with what the tenants' own records suggested had been collected. Hargreaves had not used the word he clearly meant to use. He had said irregularities. He had said the matter warranted a visit. Edmund had not come immediately. He had told himself he would send a man of business ahead. He had told himself Hargreaves was cautious to a fault, and that the accounts would explain themselves on inspection. He had told himself, which was closest to the truth, that returning to Aldermere meant returning to the house where his wife had died, in the room at the end of the gallery corridor, with the pale blue wallpaper she had chosen herself in the winter of his first year as Earl. Before he had understood what it meant to lose someone, and find that her absence had dimensions he could not measure in advance. He had come in the end because Hargreaves had laid a fourth document on the desk, a letter from a tenant farmer named Partridge, who had written in careful, unschooled hand that he did not wish to cause trouble, and that the Lord knew he was an honest man, but that he had paid his November quarter, and he had the receipt from Mr. Senner. Tench, and he did not understand why the estate steward had called again to say the November quarter remained outstanding. Edmund had read that letter 3 times. Then he had called for his traveling coat. The first thing he noticed about Aldermere village was that it was in better repair than the household accounts suggested it should be. The second thing he noticed, in the afternoon of his arrival, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Dorland, was giving him the tour of the house he had not occupied in 2 years, was that the linen press held household cloth that was impeccably mended, turned at the edges, repaired with stitching so fine it was barely visible. He touched one of the repaired pillowcases and looked at Mrs. Dorland. She said, without his having asked, that the estate seamstress had done it, the vain girl from the cottage on the South Lane. He said nothing. He filed it away the way a careful man files things. The first time he saw her directly was in the estate's great hall, on the 3rd morning of his visit, when she had been summoned by Mrs. Sandus Dorland to take measurements for new curtains in the dining room. Edmund had come through the hall on his way to the estate office and had stopped in the doorway because she was standing, with a length of measuring cord stretched between her raised hands, her lips moving slightly as she counted her attention entirely elsewhere. She wore a plain gray wool dress and a white collar. Her hair was dark auburn where it showed at the edges of her cap. Her hands were steady. She did not look up when he stopped. She finished her count, dropped her hands, and made a mark in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. Then she looked toward the doorway and she saw him, and something crossed her face that he could not name quickly enough to keep from being struck by it. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like a decision being made. She said, "My lord," and dipped a brief curtsy and returned to her measuring. He went on to the estate office. He sat down with the books Mr. Crar. Tench had laid out for inspection, and he spent 3 hours going through accounts that told him, very efficiently, a story of an estate in reasonable order. The numbers were clear, the figures were tidy, the columns balanced. He had spent enough time with Hargreaves to know that the numbers being clear and the accounts being honest were 2 entirely different conditions. He sent for Partridge, the tenant farmer, that afternoon. Partridge came, a weathered man in his 50s who removed his hat at the door of the study and held it with both hands, and was clearly frightened of saying the wrong thing. Edmund gave him a chair and a glass of something warming and asked him plainly to describe exactly what had happened with the November quarter. Partridge described it. He had paid. He had the receipt signed in Mr. Tench's own hand. The follow-up demand had come 8 days later, and when he had produced the receipt, Mr. Forsimboli, Tench's man, had said the figure on the receipt was different from the figure in the estate books, and that what Partridge called the receipt was a private accounting and not the official estate record. Edmund asked whether Partridge still had the receipt. Partridge said he did. Edmund asked to see it. If you are still with this story, know that what Partridge drew from his coat and laid on the study table was a small folded square of paper, creased with handling, with figures written in a clear commercial hand and a signature at the bottom that was recognizably Oliver Tench's. Edmund held it for a long moment. He said very carefully that he would like Partridge to leave it with him for a day, and that Partridge should go home and say nothing to anyone, and that the Earl himself would call on him before the week was out. Partridge looked at him for a moment, assessing, the way men who have been dealing with other men's authority all their lives learn to assess. Then he nodded, replaced his hat, and went. Edmund sat with the receipt in his hand, in the quiet of his dead wife's study, with the pale winter light coming through the window. And he thought about what it meant to have been away for 2 years and returned to find a man quietly stealing from him, and from the tenants both, and to have only just begun to understand the shape of what had been taken. He thought about the seamstress, and her steady hands. He saw her again the next morning, in the kitchen corridor. She was delivering a finished apron to the cook, a small, precise-spoken woman named Mrs. Hobbs, and the two of them were discussing the thread count of the next order in terms that suggested a long professional partnership. Edmund had come to the corridor to speak to Mrs. Arb. Dorlinen had stopped at the corner when he heard the voices, and he listened for a moment before he meant to. She was saying, in a voice that was low and careful, "The blue wool for the dining room curtains will need a full lining to hold at that width, or they will pull at the rings inside a season. I would rather spend the extra now than have the work undo itself." Hobbs said that seemed right to her, and that she would tell the housekeeper. Then there was a pause, and her voice changed register by a fraction, dropped quieter. "How does he seem to you, the Earl?" Mrs. Hobbs' answer was short, careful. "Looking at things. More than I expected, if I tell you true." Margaret said nothing for a moment. "Good." It was a single word, and it carried enough weight that Edmund stood still at the corner of the corridor for an extra moment after both women had moved away, trying to understand what it had meant from the mouth of the village seamstress. He was not a man who told himself he understood things he did not understand. He had the particular honesty of a person who has been wrong about an important thing and knows it, and who has learned to sit with not knowing rather than reaching for a false certainty. He thought about the word good, the way one thinks about a pebble in a shoe, consistently and without meaning to. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was a seamstress and he was an earl, and the space between them was exactly what the period understood it to be, a courteous distance measured in forms of address and the careful division of rooms. He sat that evening with the estate books again, and worked through 3 years of rental accounts, and found in the careful incrementalism of Mr. Tench's arithmetic a pattern that was plain once you knew what to look for. The missing rents were not taken in large amounts. They were taken in the spaces between things, in the fractions of collection that could be attributed to bad harvests, slow payers, temporary abatement, granted by the bailiff's own discretion. They were hidden in the very ordinariness of the accounts, in their cleanliness, in the efficiency with which the columns were kept. A man who did not look very hard would see an estate in reasonable order. A man who looked harder would begin to notice the shape of the space between what was collected and what was recorded. Edmund was looking very hard. He called on her on the 4th morning. He told himself he was calling on her about the curtains. He told himself he had questions about the household linen order that Mrs. Dorlin had suggested required the seamstress's input. He had, in fact, no particular curtain questions, and Mrs. Dorlin had suggested no such thing. He walked to the cottage on the South Lane, in the thin November light, with the collar of his coat turned up, and found himself standing at a plain door, with a brass knocker shaped like a fox's head, which struck him as either optimistic or ironic, given the foxes and the situation. She answered herself. The cottage was too small for a servant. She said, "My lord," and held the door, and stepped back. The inside of the cottage was very neat. The work table occupied the main window, and the light from the window fell across bolts of cloth and an open work basket and a notebook covered in a small, even hand. A fire burned in the hearth. The room smelled of beeswax and wool and something faintly sweet he could not identify. It was a working room, not a parlor, and she did not apologize for it, or offer to move them to anywhere more formal. She simply gestured to the chair nearest the fire and waited. He sat. She stood at the work table, turned to face him, her hands at her sides. He said more directly than he had intended, "You read figures." Her face did not move. She said, "My father was the estate bookkeeper. For 7 years, my lord, he taught me what he knew." Edmund said, "Your father died 14 months ago." "Yes." "Before that, you assisted him with the accounts. I copied the columns for him when his eyes were failing. In the last year, I did most of the work." A pause. "He reviewed everything I produced and signed it." Edmund said, "He taught you what he knew." Again, as though hearing it differently this time. "Yes," she said. "He thought it useful. He was not wrong. The moment held between them with a tension that had no name in the polite vocabulary either of them would have used to describe it. He was looking at her. She was looking at him with the same quality of attention she had brought to the measuring cord. The measuring. Steady, exact, assessing. He said quietly, "I believe there may be a problem." With the estate rental accounts, she said nothing. He said, "I wonder if you have any knowledge that might help me understand it." She was still for a count of 5, and then she turned to the work table and she opened the drawer beneath it, and she placed on the table a ledger he recognized as an estate document. She placed it with a care that suggested she had thought about this moment and had decided that if it came, she would not be slow to meet it. She said, "I found it in the lining of a coat brought to me for mending 2 weeks ago. I could not return it without being asked where I had found it, and I did not trust the person who would ask." She looked at him steadily. "I have not moved it since. I have not shown it to anyone. I have studied it." Edmund did not speak immediately. He picked up the ledger and opened it. She said, "If you look at pages 12 through 27, the collected column and the remitted column diverge in a pattern I can show you. I have been keeping a parallel record." She offered him the notebook from the work table. He took both. He sat with them in the firelight for a long time, going between them. And the room was very quiet except for the fire and the sound of her needle, which had resumed because she was not the kind of woman to stand still waiting for someone else's judgment to fall. When he finally looked up, she was working steadily, not looking at him. He said carefully, "Miss Vane." She looked up. He said, "How long have you been keeping this parallel record?" "Since the 3rd night after I found the ledger." He said, "What prevented you from bringing it to the estate office?" She held his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Tench manages the estate office, my lord." The air in the room shifted. He understood, in that moment, the full weight of what she had been doing alone in this cottage, holding a piece of evidence against a man who had all the institutional authority of the estate behind him, with nowhere to take it that was not already within his reach, waiting for a lord who had not come to Aldermere in 2 years and might not come at all. He said more quietly than he had said anything, "You have been waiting." She said, "I have been accurate," which seemed the more useful occupation. He left the cottage 20 minutes later with the ledger and the notebook under his arm. He did not look back. He walked to the estate office where he found Mr. Tench reviewing correspondence at the large central desk with the relaxed authority of a man who is never expected to be checked. Edmund placed the ledger on the desk in front of him and asked him, in a tone that left no interpretive room, to explain the discrepancy between pages 12 through 27 in the collected column and the remitted column. Tench looked at the ledger. He looked at Edmund. He said after a moment that the ledger was an old working copy, not an official document, and that the discrepancies would be explained by the final accounts. Edmund said he would like to see the final accounts. Tench said they were at the land agents in town. Edmund said he would send for them today. The color of the room changed, which is to say that Tench's face changed, and Edmund watched it change, and he did not hurry. He let the silence do its work. A bailiff who has been pocketing estate rents for 14 months and has never been caught does not collapse immediately when confronted. He makes calculations. Edmund watched the calculations happening behind Tench's eyes, and he waited. "Why the captions?" Tench said that some adjustments may have been made to the collection records that he had not yet reconciled. Edmund said he understood. He said he would like Tench to produce every receipt he had issued to tenants for the past 14 months and to lay them beside the estate accounts, and that he had already spoken to several tenants who had retained their own copies of those receipts. He said it evenly, without heat, with the particular quality of authority that belongs to a man who knows the exact shape of the other man's situation and who does not feel it necessary to be cruel about it. He left Tench in the estate office with the ledger, and went to the study and wrote 2 letters, one to Hargreaves the solicitor, directing him to travel to Aldermere with all urgency, and one to the magistrate of the county. He did not write a 3rd letter. He went instead. The cold had deepened through the afternoon. and the lane to the cottage on the south side was empty of foot traffic. He knocked at the plain door with a foxhead knocker, and she answered again. And this time he could see in her face that she had expected the knock or something like it. He stood in the doorway and said, "I need you to make a statement to the magistrate. Everything you observed in the ledger, the methodology of the record you kept, the manner in which you came to have the document in your possession. It will not be comfortable. Tench's solicitor will likely contest the chain of possession." She said, "I kept a written account of every date and action from the night I found the ledger, my lord. The account is dated and signed each evening. And I have 2 witnesses who saw me make the first entry." He looked at her. She said a little dryly, "Mrs. Hobbs and the blacksmith's wife were here that evening for a fitting. I asked them to witness the date and my signature in the account book. I told them I had found an estate document and was recording its provenance in case it was needed. Neither of them asked further." He said after a moment, "You anticipated a legal challenge." "My father was a bookkeeper," she said. "Provenance is not a complicated idea if someone has taken the trouble to teach you." He stood in the doorway of the cottage with the cold at his back, and the firelight making its particular warmth inside the room, and he looked at this woman who had been sitting alone in a cottage with stolen evidence, building a documented case against a man with institutional power, in precise, careful silence. And he thought of 2 years in London telling himself that returning to Aldermere would be painful, and so he would not return. He thought of the tenants he had not seen. He thought of the farmer Partridge holding a crumpled receipt between both hands. He thought of the pale blue wallpaper in the room at the end of the gallery. He said, "Miss Vane, I owe this village a considerable accounting." She looked at him with precision, the way she measured cloth. Exactly, allowing neither more nor less than was there. She said, "Then I suggest, my lord, that you begin with the magistrate." There was something almost like a laugh in that. Not quite, because they were standing in a doorway in the November cold, and the situation was not humorous. But the ghost of it passed between them, acknowledged and released, and then she stepped back from the door with a formality that was equally a kind of welcome, and he came inside. The magistrate, Sir Thomas Elling, arrived the next morning. Margaret came to the great house to give her statement, which she did in the estate office with Edmund present and Hargreaves present, and Sir Thomas taking notes in his own cramped hand. And she was precise in the way she was always precise, calm in the way she was calm, when she was working, not because the situation was not frightening, but because she had decided beforehand what she owed to it, and was paying that debt in the only currency she had, exactness. Tench sat across the room throughout, accompanied by his own man of business, and Margaret felt his eyes on her with a quality that she recognized as calculation, as the swift measuring of what she could prove and what she could not. She did not look at him. She looked at the magistrate and answered his questions, and she produced the account book with the dated entries and the signatures of Mrs. Hobbs and Mrs. Carver, the blacksmith's wife, and she produced the notebook with the parallel columns, and she waited. The dismissal was not cruel. When it came, Mr. Frass. Tench had left the room to confer with his man of business, and Edmund said in a voice low enough that it did not carry, "You have done this extremely well." She had been expecting something procedural. She said, "I did only what the situation required." He said most people would not have known what the situation required, or they would have known and would not have been willing to pay the cost of it. She thought of 2 weeks of sitting with a document that could be taken from her at any moment, of keeping the parallel record in a notation so small she had needed her best candle to write it, of Mrs. Hobbs, Carver looking at her with puzzled patience in the fitting room, while she asked them to sign their names beside a date in an account book. She thought of all the ways it might have come to nothing. He thought which was the truest thing, and the thing she would not say, that she had been afraid from the beginning, and had done it anyway, because the alternative was to put it in a drawer and pretend she had never seen it, and she was not made that way. She said nothing of this. She said, "My father believed that a correctly kept account is a form of justice. I tried to keep it correctly." He looked at her in a way she had difficulty classifying. It was not the look of a lord assessing a useful tenant. It was something more direct than that, more personal, and it made her look away toward the window, and the frost still on the panes at midday. Hargreaves confirmed by the end of the week that the total sum concealed over 14 months amounted to just over £240. Edmund said nothing when the figure was read to him. He sat with it for a moment and then asked Hargreaves to prepare the appropriate documentation for the magistrate and to calculate what was owed to each tenant whose payments had been used to pad the shortfall. He then rode out to see each tenant individually. He rode in the November cold on 4 successive mornings to farms and small holdings in the two-tied cottages at the edge of the estate, and he sat with each family and acknowledged what had been done under his authority in his absence, and he told each of them directly what restitution would be made and by what date. He called on Partridge last. Partridge received him in the kitchen, the only room warm enough, and his wife stood at the stove, and his 3 children stayed close to her and watched the Earl with the large eyes of children assessing a situation they do not yet have words for. Edmund drank the offered tea. He told Partridge the exact figure that would be returned and the manner in which it would be returned, and he asked Partridge at the end whether there was anything else the estate could do. Partridge looked at him for a long time, the same assessing look as before, and then he said that the only thing he'd ask was that the Earl not disappear again. Not for 2 years at a stretch, with only tench between the tenants and the lord. He said it quietly, without accusation, and then looked at his hat. Edmund said, "No, I will not." He said it in a tone that was not a performance of contrition and not a promise designed to comfort. It was simply the truth, stated plainly, the way a man states a thing he has already decided before the words form. Partridge looked at him again, and nodded, and the kitchen returned to its ordinary sounds. He went back to the great house. He walked through the gallery on his way to the study, and he stopped, as he did not always stop now, outside the room at the end of the corridor. The door was closed. The pale blue wallpaper was on the other side of it. He stood there for a moment with his hand not quite touching the door handle, and he thought of Eleanor, who had chosen the wallpaper in her first year here, who had said that the blue was the color of early morning, who had been 26 years old and had loved the estate with an uncomplicated naturalness he had not understood while she was alive, because he had never had to understand it until she was gone. He had blamed himself in the first year of her absence with a thoroughness that left no room for anything else. He had catalogued the ways he had not been present enough, had not returned soon enough from London in the autumn she died, had not noticed the signs that the illness was worse than she was telling him. He had kept those catalogues for a long time, as though accuracy in one's own guilt were a form of faithfulness to the person lost. In the second year, he had understood that this was not faithfulness, that Eleanor, who had been precise and practical and clear-eyed, would have told him so herself. He stood in the corridor and let the understanding rest in him, the way one learns to let a thing rest rather than carry it continually. Then he walked on to the study. If you have followed this account with patience, you will have been waiting for the thing that was, in the event, not loud. There was no ballroom. There was no public drama of the kind that required a crowd to witness it. No announcement made across a room full of turning heads. What there was this. He asked to call on her on the Saturday before Christmas, which was the day the Aldermere estate books were formally closed on the audit by the magistrate's appointed review. He sent a note around in the morning, through Mrs. Moore. Dorland's girl, and Margaret read it at the work table and set it aside, and pressed her hands flat on the cloth she was hemming, and made herself continue with the hemming before she allowed herself to think about what it meant that an earl was requesting permission to call. She knew what it meant. She had known it in the way one knows a thing one is not ready to name, for the better part of 3 weeks. She had seen the quality of his attention to her at the magistrate's session and in the estate office afterward and in the corridor once more time, when he had stopped to ask her simply whether the household curtain order had everything it needed. She knew it, and she was afraid of it, in a way she was not ready to be afraid, which is to say, she was afraid not of him, but of the distance between his life and hers, the distance that was not merely rank, but the entire apparatus of rank, the house at the end of the lane, and the cottage at the other end of it, the difference between what she was and what such a man's wife was required to be. She told herself that knowing a thing was different from being ready for it. He came at 3 o'clock, which was the polite hour, and she had the fire going and had changed into the better of her 2 afternoon dresses, the dark green wool that her mother had left her, and she felt, standing in her own kitchen, waiting for the knock. The particular absurdity of being careful about a dress when the situation had nothing to do with the dress. He knocked. She answered. He came inside and refused the offer of tea with a brevity that told her he had prepared himself to speak directly, and was going to do it before the tea could give him a reason to wait. He said, "I am aware that what I am about to propose will seem precipitate, given that we have known each other for less than a month." She said, "I have known you for less than a month. You have known what I am capable of for approximately 2 weeks." He looked at her with an expression that was the closest to warmth she had yet seen from him. Not a smile exactly, but the softening around the eyes of a man who has just been told a precise truth he had not quite formulated himself. He said, "Yes, exactly that." He paused. "I am proposing, Miss Vane, that you consider becoming the Countess of Ketteridge." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the first true snow of winter had begun to fall, in the slow, soft manner of early winter snow that lands without sound and stays. She looked at him. He stood in the middle of her work-table room with the snow behind him and his coat still cold from the walk and his face very still, waiting. She said, "I need to tell you something first." He said, "Yes." She said, "When I found the ledger, I was afraid for 2 weeks. Not of Mr. Tench specifically. I was afraid that I would do everything correctly, and it would not be enough because I had no standing. Because I was a seamstress's cottage on the South Lane, and you were 2 years in London, and Tench was the authority in between. I kept the account book and the parallel record, and I found the witnesses. But I was afraid the entire time that none of it would matter, because there was no one with the rank to make it matter." She said it looking at him directly, because she had decided that if he was going to propose marriage, she was going to meet him with the same accuracy she brought to everything else. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I was 2 years in London, and I did not come back. And the tenants paid their rents twice. And you sat alone in this room with a document you could not safely return, and built a case with 2 witnesses and a dated account book." He said it without any performance, flatly, as though reading a sum. "You were right to be afraid that no one with rank would come? I was not here." She said nothing. He said, "I am here now." It was not the declaration one expects of such moments. It was 4 words, spoken quietly, in the voice of a man who had learned the difference between what sounds right and what is. She understood it, the way she understood a correctly kept column, not because it was elaborate, but because it added. She said, "Yes." He looked at her. She said, "To the proposal." "Yes." He crossed the 3 feet between them, and took her hand the way one takes a hand one has been thinking about for weeks, carefully, as though the care itself says something that the words have not. Her hand was cold. His hand was cold. The fire was warm, and the snow was falling outside the cottage window. And he held her hand in both of his, and spoke her name. "Margaret," he said, which was the first time he had used it, and she felt it in the way she felt such things, in the throat, and in the hands, and in a warmth that had no origin she could precisely locate. The legal arrangements were made by Hargreaves, who arrived before Christmas with the papers and a manner of scrupulous professional neutrality that could not entirely conceal his surprise. Edmund signed. Margaret signed. The settlement was generous and precisely drawn, with provisions she had not thought to expect, and which she read through twice with the same small, careful attention she brought to everything. Hargreaves watched her read and said nothing. But when she looked up and said she had one question about the 3rd clause, he blinked and answered it fully. The announcement was made on the 22nd of December at the estate's annual gathering for the tenants, a modest event in the great hall that Mrs. Dorlin organized with candles and mulled wine, and the particular air of a household that has been reminded it has a lord. Edmund stood at the head of the room, and made the announcement in the same direct manner he had spoken to Partridge, plainly with the facts given in order. He said that he was engaged to be married to Miss Margaret Vane, of the village, daughter of the estate's late bookkeeper, and that the wedding would take place in the spring. There was a silence that lasted for approximately 3 seconds, during which every person in the room recalculated approximately everything they thought they knew about the year. Then Partridge, who was standing near the back with his hat in his hand, said, "Good," in a voice loud enough to carry, and the room began to move again. Mr. Tench was not in the room. He had been relieved of his position a fortnight prior and had retired, under something considerably less than his own choosing, to a property belonging to a cousin in another county, with the complete cooperation of the magistrate's findings and a document of formal restitution signed by his own man of business. He had not left quietly. He had left inevitably, which was a different thing, and which was the only thing that this kind of case could offer. Lady Rossmore, who was the widow of a baronet and had been spending Christmas at the Elling house and had come to the gathering with Sir Thomas's party, said to her neighbor at the hour's end that she supposed the girl must have some family connection that excused the match, and that she would certainly inquire. She did not inquire. She found, over the next hour, that her inquiries were not returned with the interest she expected. The room had made its judgment, and it was not, in this instance, aligned with hers. Margaret stood beside Edmund for most of the evening, wearing the dark green dress, and she felt the room's attention on her with a quality she had not before experienced, which was the quality of attention that had decided to look, rather than to dismiss. It was not comfortable, exactly. She was not accustomed to it, but she found that she could stand in it with steadiness, because she had already stood in the other kind. The winter settled over Aldermere in the weeks that followed, with the particular rightness of a winter that has decided to do its job properly. The accounts were closed by Hargreaves, and the restitutions made to each tenant before the new year. Partridge received his payment on the 28th of December, and shook Edmund's hand with both of his in the farmyard, with his 3 children watching from the kitchen door. She moved into the great house in February at Edmund's insistence to spare her the cottage's increasingly inadequate fire and the distance from the fittings and fittings-related decisions that Mrs. Einden Dorland was generating with considerable speed. She brought very little with her: the work-basket, the notebook, the bolts of cloth she was mid-project on, her father's set of bookkeeping ledgers tied with brown paper, and a small frame sketch of her mother that she hung in the room she was given, which was not the room at the end of the gallery with the pale blue wallpaper. She found that room's door still closed. One morning in February, when she was passing through the gallery with an armful of fabric samples, she stopped, and she set the samples down on the gallery bench, and she stood for a moment, looking at the closed door. Edmund had told her about Eleanor in December, sitting in the study, by the fire, in a manner that was careful and honest, and that had the quality of a man recounting a thing he had decided it was right to recount rather than keep. He had said that Eleanor had been young, and that he had not come back from London soon enough, and that he had carried the weight of that for a long time, and that he did not think the weight would ever be entirely absent, but that it was different now. He had said it in the level way he said things that mattered, and she had listened the way she listened, without filling the pauses with reassurance. She stood at the gallery door, and she thought about Eleanor, whom she had not known. She thought about the woman who had chosen the color of the wallpaper, and had loved the estate with uncomplicated naturalness, and had been 26 years old. She thought about what it cost a person to keep faith with a loss without being consumed by it, and she thought about the notebook on her work table with the dated entries, which was its own kind of keeping faith. After a moment, she picked up the fabric samples and went on down the gallery. The door stayed closed. There was time, and she was patient, and she knew the difference between a thing that needed to be rushed and a thing that needed to be accurate. The wedding was in April, small as they had agreed with Hargreaves and Sir Thomas Elling, and Mrs. Dorland and Mrs. Hobbs and Mrs. Carver, the blacksmith's wife, and the Partridge family, all present, the 3 children in their best coats, and considerably interested in the proceedings. The vicar was a young man who read the service clearly and did not embellish it. Afterward, in the great hall with the spring light coming through the long windows for the first time that year, Edmund looked at her across the room with the particular quality of attention that she had learned to recognize and had not yet entirely learned to receive, without a flush of warmth that she hoped every time was not entirely visible. She thought it probably was. She thought with a composure that was genuine and warm both at once, that she did not precisely mind. That evening in the study where she had been given a desk beside his for the past 6 weeks because the estate books needed 2 pairs of eyes, and he had said so matter-of-factly, she sat in the April dark and opened her father's small leather-bound bookkeeping manual, the one he had used to teach her. The spine was held together with a wrap of black thread she had stitched herself 14 months ago when it had begun to separate. She ran her thumb along the spine and thought of her father who had believed that a correctly kept account was a form of justice, and who had taught her to count before he taught her to read, and who had left her a cottage and a trade and a habit of precision that had proved in the end to be exactly enough. Edmund came in from the corridor with 2 candles and set them on the mantelpiece without being asked, because he had learned in 6 weeks of sharing this room what the light level needed to be for her to work comfortably. He sat down at his own desk and picked up the correspondence from the morning which had been waiting since the ceremony, and the room settled into its particular quiet that was made of 2 people working in the same light. Outside the study window the April night was clear, with no frost remaining, and somewhere in the orchard the first birds of spring were finishing their last song. Margaret set her father's manual in its place on the shelf beside the new account book she had begun for the estate's spring quarter, and she picked up the pen, and she opened the first clean page, and she began. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If Margaret's particular kind of courage moved you, leave a word in the comments below, and do come back for the next story on this channel.